What would you do if the boss you never saw coming was silently watching everything? When an undercover CEO witnesses his team ruthlessly bullying a vulnerable new hire, his shocking response flips the entire workplace on its head, and what happens next takes the internet by storm. This story will leave you speechless. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The morning air was crisp as Ethan Grayson stood at the entrance of the company he had built from scratch. It was strange seeing his name etched into the building's glass doors, knowing that for the next few weeks, no one would associate it with him. Today, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't the visionary leader who had turned a fledgling startup into a thriving enterprise. Today, he was Eli Grayson, a temp worker, just another cog in the corporate machine. Adjusting the collar of his plain button-down shirt, he took a deep breath, feeling an unfamiliar mix of nerves and excitement. The decision to go undercover hadn't been easy. Over the past few months, Ethan had sensed something was wrong. Anonymous complaints about toxic workplace behavior had landed on his desk, but every inquiry he initiated through management came back with the same response. Nothing serious, just misunderstandings. Still, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that his company's culture had drifted far from the values he'd once instilled. It wasn't just the complaints. Customer satisfaction was dipping. Turnover rates were creeping up, and his employees, once his greatest source of pride, now felt like strangers. His wife, Claire, had encouraged him to do something drastic. "If you really want to know what's going on, Ethan, you need to see it for yourself," she had said. And now here he was, blending in, ready to see his creation through an entirely different lens. As he stepped inside, the familiar hum of activity greeted him, but it felt different now. Without the polished suit and air of authority, he was no longer the center of attention. No one rushed to greet him, no one whispered updates about meetings or deals. He was just another face in the sea of employees. The receptionist barely looked up as he signed in and clipped a visitor badge to his shirt. For the first time in years, Ethan felt invisible, and he realized how much he had missed it. He was directed to the operations department, a bustling area filled with cubicles, filing cabinets, and employees who moved quickly, their faces etched with varying degrees of focus and frustration. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone gave him a quick orientation. "Stick with Derek," she said, pointing toward a tall, broad-shouldered man who was chatting loudly with a small group. "He'll show you the ropes. Don't expect much hand-holding, though." Her tone implied that asking questions might be a mistake. Ethan approached Derek with an outstretched hand, masking his unease with a friendly smile. Derek glanced at him, then at the hand, before giving it a quick, almost reluctant shake. "You're the new guy?" he asked, his voice loud enough to make nearby employees glance over. Without waiting for a response, Derek turned back to his group. "Eli, was it? Yeah, just follow me. Try to keep up and don't screw anything up." The group laughed, and Ethan felt the first hint of what he suspected was going wrong here. As he followed Derek, Ethan's attention was drawn to a young woman sitting quietly at a desk near the back of the room. She was hunched over, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her face as she typed furiously. There was a tension in her shoulders, a kind of guardedness that immediately caught his eye. Derek noticed him looking and smirked. "That's Maya," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make the words feel conspiratorial. "She's new too. Barely been here a week and already screwing things up. You'll see." He chuckled, and the group with him chuckled too, though it felt forced. Ethan glanced at Maya again and noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she moved her mouse. It wasn't hard to guess that Derek's words weren't entirely unfounded, or that he had made sure they wouldn't be. Over the next hour, Ethan shadowed Derek, listening as he rattled off instructions in a tone that bordered on condescending. He noticed how Derek's voice shifted when addressing others, boisterous and overbearing with the men, dismissive and patronizing with the women. It wasn't long before Ethan saw the subtle ways the workplace hierarchy played out. Employees like Derek dominated the space, while quieter ones like Maya stayed in the background, trying not to draw attention. At lunch, Ethan sat in the break room, observing the dynamics more closely. Maya entered, carrying a small lunchbox, and hesitated at the door as she scanned the room. Her gaze landed on a table near the corner, where Priya, a kind-faced woman Ethan had noticed earlier, was eating alone. Before Maya could take a step, Derek called out from another table, flanked by Lena and Jason. "Hey, new girl, don't forget to clock out next time you take an hour to fix a mistake. You know, the one we had to fix for you." His tone was dripping with mockery, and Lena let out a high-pitched laugh. Jason added, "At this rate, you'll owe us overtime." The room fell silent, save for a few awkward coughs and the sound of utensils scraping plates. Maya froze, her cheeks flushing as she clutched her lunchbox tighter. For a moment, Ethan thought she might turn and leave, but instead, she walked to Priya's table and sat down, her movements stiff and deliberate. Priya offered her a tentative smile, but the damage was done. Maya kept her head down, barely touching her food. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He reminded himself why he was here, not to intervene yet, but to observe, to understand the extent of the problem. Still, he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He had seen bullying before, in schoolyards and boardrooms alike. But it was different when it was happening under his roof, in the company he had built on values of respect and collaboration. By the end of the day, Ethan had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. The culture was broken, and people like Derek were running the show. But what troubled him even more was how easily the others had accepted it. It wasn't just Derek. It was the silence, the complicity, the way everyone seemed to look the other way. As he clocked out, the weight of the day settled on him. This was only the beginning, and he had no idea how deep the problem went. The second day began with the same hum of activity as the first, but this time, Ethan entered the office with sharper eyes and a growing determination. He had spent the night replaying the events of the previous day, piecing together what he had seen. Derek's dominance was clear, but what bothered Ethan most was how others fell in line, either through fear or apathy. That wasn't the culture he had envisioned for his company, and yet it had taken root right under his nose. Today he intended to see just how far the toxicity extended. Maya was already at her desk when Ethan arrived, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. A faint shadow of exhaustion lingered under her eyes, and Ethan guessed she hadn't slept much. She worked quietly, occasionally stealing glances around the room as if expecting another attack. Ethan resisted the urge to approach her directly. He couldn't risk breaking his cover. Not yet. Derek, on the other hand, was in his usual form, leaning against a desk and entertaining his audience with exaggerated stories. "You should have seen her," he said loudly, gesturing toward Maya's desk with a grin. "Took her 3 tries to send 1 email. Guess basic instructions were too much to handle." The group laughed on cue, though some of them avoided eye contact, their smiles more strained than amused. Ethan watched Priya glance at Maya, her expression tight with discomfort, but she said nothing. The morning dragged on with Derek assigning tasks in the same condescending tone as the day before. Maya was his primary target, but Ethan noticed he wasn't above making snide remarks to others as well. When one of the quieter employees, a man named Alex, struggled to organize a shipment schedule, Derek smirked and muttered, "Figures. They really don't hire for brains anymore." Alex stiffened but kept his head down, his fingers typing faster, as if to escape the ridicule. It wasn't as personal as what Maya endured, but it was enough to paint a clear picture. Derek thrived on control and humiliation. Ethan's chance to interact with Maya came just before lunch. Derek had assigned them both to inventory a supply closet, a task Ethan suspected he viewed as menial busywork. The closet was cramped and dusty, the air thick with the smell of cleaning supplies. Maya avoided eye contact as they worked, her movements stiff and hurried. Ethan decided to break the silence. "You're doing a good job," he said simply, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She froze for a moment, her hands clutching a clipboard, before offering a faint, disbelieving smile. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up, and Ethan realized how rare it must have been for her to hear those words in this place. "You've been here, what, a week?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. 6 days, she said, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been an attempt at humor. "Not that anyone's counting," Ethan chuckled softly. "New jobs are always tough at first. You're handling it better than most would, considering—" He trailed off, letting the weight of his unspoken words settle between them. Maya's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time, she looked at him directly. "Considering what?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and caution. Ethan hesitated. He couldn't risk revealing too much, so he shrugged and said, "Considering the way some people around here treat new hires, it's not right." Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly looked away. "It's fine," she said, her tone flat and unconvincing. "I can handle it." Ethan wanted to press further, but before he could, the door creaked open, and Derek's voice boomed from behind them. "What's taking so long in here? Need me to show you how to count, Eli?" The moment shattered, Maya immediately straightening and turning back to the shelves. Derek's grin widened as he leaned against the doorframe, his gaze flicking between them. "Don't let her slow you down, man," he added with a smirk, jerking his thumb toward Maya. "I know how hard it is to keep up with her pace." Ethan clenched his jaw, but forced himself to laugh lightly, playing the part of the easygoing temp. "We're almost done," he said, deliberately keeping his tone neutral. Derek lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for a reaction, before finally sauntering off. Maya didn't say another word as they finished the inventory. Her expression was carefully blank, but Ethan could sense the tension radiating off her. He felt a pang of guilt for not standing up to Derek, even though he knew it would have jeopardized everything. For now, all he could do was lay the groundwork for what was to come. After lunch, the day took a darker turn. Derek orchestrated an impromptu meeting in the break room, where he decided to review the team's recent performance. It quickly became clear that his real goal was to humiliate Maya. "So," Derek began, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, "who wants to guess how many errors our star rookie made this week?" The room fell silent. Maya stared at the table in front of her, her hands clenched in her lap. Priya shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward Maya, but she remained silent. Derek waited a beat, then looked directly at Jason. "Come on, Jason. Take a guess." Jason hesitated, glancing at Maya before muttering, 3? 3? Derek scoffed. "Try 5. 5 mistakes in 6 days, that's gotta be some kind of record." He laughed, and though a few others joined in, the sound was hollow. Ethan watched Maya's face, noting the way her jaw tightened and her breathing grew shallow. This wasn't just about mistakes, this was about power. Derek wanted to crush her, to remind her and everyone else who was in charge. Ethan felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't tip his hand yet, not here, not like this. When the meeting ended, Maya left the room quickly, her head down and her shoulders stiff. Ethan caught Priya's eye, silently willing her to say something, but she only looked away. As the rest of the team dispersed, Ethan made a decision. If no one else was going to step up, he would. But first, he needed more evidence. Something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Something that would force everyone to face the truth. As Ethan returned to his desk, a plan began to take shape in his mind. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but one thing was clear. Derek's reign of terror was coming to an end. The third day began with a quiet resolve. Ethan arrived early, slipping into the office before most of the team. He used the time to review the company's internal communication logs and performance reports, documents he could access as the undercover owner, but not as Eli Grayson. What he found confirmed his suspicions. Derek's department had a history of unusually high turnover rates, but complaints filed by former employees were either dismissed or quietly buried. It was a pattern of negligence that enraged Ethan. Somehow, Derek had become untouchable, and the system that was supposed to protect employees had failed them. By mid-morning, the office was bustling again. Ethan kept a low profile, quietly observing as the day unfolded. Maya, as always, was at her desk, typing away with a quiet intensity. He noticed how she flinched when Derek passed by, even when he didn't say anything. The tension in her posture spoke volumes. It wasn't just what Derek said or did, but the constant, looming presence of his disdain. Derek, for his part, was in an unusually good mood. He strutted around the office, joking loudly with Jason and Lena. Ethan couldn't help but notice how easily their laughter masked the venom in their comments. To an outsider, it might have seemed like harmless workplace banter. But Ethan saw the way Maya's expression tightened with every passing remark. It was a constant barrage of small, cutting jabs, just enough to make her feel unwelcome without crossing the line into outright harassment. It was calculated, deliberate, and infuriating. Around midday, Ethan found himself assigned to a project with Priya and Alex. It was a rare moment of respite from Derek's presence, and Ethan took the opportunity to get a sense of the dynamics within the rest of the team. Priya, he noticed, was diligent and soft-spoken, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Alex, on the other hand, seemed nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Derek to appear at any moment. "Alex," Ethan said casually as they worked, "have you been here long?" Alex hesitated, his fingers pausing over his keyboard. About 2 years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "And how's it been? I mean, working in this department?" Alex glanced at Priya, who kept her eyes on her screen but seemed to be listening intently. "It's fine," he said quickly. Too quickly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, giving Alex a reassuring smile. "You don't have to sugarcoat it. I'm just trying to get a sense of how things work around here." Alex hesitated again, his gaze darting toward the doorway. When he finally spoke, his voice was even quieter. "It depends. Some days are better than others. It's easier if you just keep your head down." Priya's fingers froze over her keyboard, and she finally looked up, her expression conflicted. "It's not always bad," she said cautiously. "But there are certain people you don't want to get on the wrong side of." Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. "Like Derek?" Priya and Alex exchanged a quick, nervous glance. Neither of them answered, but their silence spoke volumes. Ethan didn't press further. He knew they were afraid, and he couldn't blame them. Derek's influence was pervasive, and the fear of retaliation was real. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan kept a closer eye on Derek's interactions with the team. It was a subtle art, the way Derek manipulated people. With Jason and Lena, he was all camaraderie and jokes, reinforcing their loyalty with praise and attention. With Priya and Alex, he alternated between dismissive indifference and thinly veiled criticism, keeping them off balance and unsure of their place. And with Maya, he was relentless, chipping away at her confidence with every passing hour. By the time the day ended, Ethan was more convinced than ever that Derek was the root of the problem. But he also knew that taking Derek down wouldn't be enough. The culture that allowed someone like Derek to thrive was the real issue, and changing that would require more than just firing one man. It would require a complete overhaul of how the company handled accountability, leadership, and employee well-being. That evening, as Ethan left the office, he noticed Maya sitting on a bench outside, her lunchbox resting on her lap. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped and her expression distant. For a moment, Ethan considered walking over to talk to her, but he stopped himself. He couldn't risk revealing his true identity, not yet. Instead, he made a silent promise to himself. He would fix this, not just for Maya, but for every employee who had been made to feel small, powerless, or invisible. He walked to his car, his mind racing with ideas. Tomorrow, he would start putting his plan into action. It was time to turn the tables. Ethan arrived earlier than usual the next morning, the faint light of dawn spilling through the windows as he stepped into the quiet office. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, one he had started using to document everything he had observed, specific incidents, interactions, and even subtle body language shifts. He knew he couldn't just confront Derek outright. To enact real change, he needed undeniable proof of Derek's behavior, and more importantly, a clear plan to rebuild the culture from the ground up. By the time the rest of the office began trickling in, Ethan was already at his desk, reviewing yesterday's notes. He noticed Priya arrive first, her expression focused but subdued as she made her way to her desk. Then came Alex, who gave a polite nod in Ethan's direction before slipping into his usual spot. Maya walked in shortly after, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. Her steps were hurried, her head down, as if she hoped to blend into the background. Derek entered last, his booming voice breaking the morning quiet as he greeted Jason and Lena with his usual over-the-top bravado. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Conversations grew quieter, movements more cautious, as if everyone subconsciously braced themselves for the day's first barrage of ridicule. Ethan watched Derek closely, noting how his mere presence seemed to command an oppressive authority. Ethan's first move came just before lunch, during a team meeting that Derek had called. As usual, the meeting was little more than an opportunity for Derek to assert his dominance, peppering his updates with thinly veiled jabs at the team's performance. Today, however, Ethan decided to steer the conversation. "Excuse me, Derek," Ethan said, raising his hand slightly as if asking for permission. Derek raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the interruption. "I was wondering if we could clarify the expectations for the next project. It seems like there's been some confusion, and I think it might help everyone stay on the same page." Derek's smile tightened. "Confusion? What confusion? It's all pretty straightforward. Unless you're having trouble keeping up, Eli." The room went still. All eyes shifted to Ethan, waiting to see how he would respond. He felt the weight of their stares but kept his tone calm. "Not at all. I just think it might be helpful to review so that we're all aligned. Clear expectations usually lead to better results, right?" A faint ripple of agreement ran through the room. Priya nodded subtly, and even Alex seemed to relax slightly in his seat. Derek's jaw twitched, but he forced a laugh. "Sure, Eli. If you think we need to dumb it down, we can go over it again." Ethan let the jab roll off his shoulders, focusing instead on the team. He asked questions, clarifying details and drawing out contributions from others who rarely spoke up. Slowly, the meeting began to shift. For the first time, it wasn't just Derek talking. Priya offered a suggestion, her voice gaining confidence as she explained her idea. Even Alex chimed in, hesitantly at first, but growing more assured as Ethan encouraged him. Derek's irritation was palpable by the end of the meeting. His usual dominance had been challenged, and though he masked it with forced smiles and sarcasm, Ethan could see the cracks forming. It was a small victory, but an important one. The real breakthrough came later that afternoon. Ethan noticed Maya struggling with a complex report, her brow furrowed as she flipped through a stack of papers. He approached her desk casually, keeping his voice low so as not to attract attention. "Need a hand?" Maya glanced up, surprise flickering across her face. "Oh, it's fine. I can figure it out." "I don't mind," Ethan said, pulling up a chair. "Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes helps." For a moment she hesitated, her pride warring with her frustration. Finally she sighed and slid the papers toward him. "It's just this section. I don't think the data's adding up." Ethan scanned the documents quickly, identifying the issue almost immediately. As they worked together, Maya began to relax, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine curiosity. She asked questions, her voice growing more confident with each answer he provided. By the time they finished, she was smiling, faintly, but it was there. "Thanks," she said, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I appreciate it." "Any time," Ethan replied. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You're doing a good job, you know. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Maya blinked, her expression softening into something Ethan could only describe as gratitude. "I'll try," she said quietly. The moment was interrupted by Derek's voice, loud and sharp. "Hey, Eli, you're not slacking off over there, are you?" Ethan turned, forcing a neutral expression. Just helping out with the report. We're all set now. Derek narrowed his eyes but didn't press further, though Ethan could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. It was clear that Derek was beginning to see him as more than just a harmless temp, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. As the day wound down, Ethan found himself reflecting on the progress he had made. It wasn't much, a small shift in the team dynamic, a moment of connection with Maya. But it was enough to give him hope. He could feel the cracks spreading in Derek's facade, the faint stirrings of change beginning to take root. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time he felt certain that he was moving in the right direction. This wasn't just about exposing Derek or fixing the company's culture. It was about showing people like Maya that they weren't alone, that someone was willing to stand up for them. And as he left the office that evening, he couldn't help but feel that change was closer than it seemed. The morning tension in the office felt thicker than usual as Ethan stepped inside, his instincts on high alert. Derek's behavior had shifted subtly but noticeably. His usual boisterous confidence seemed forced, his jokes louder and more exaggerated, as if he were compensating for something. Ethan could tell that Derek had begun to see him as a threat, though Derek likely couldn't pinpoint why. It was the first sign that the balance of power was shifting, and Ethan intended to press further. Maya was already at her desk, typing furiously, her movements more deliberate than before. She still carried the weight of the previous days, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes, a small shift, but one that Ethan noticed. He saw her glance at him briefly as he walked by, a flicker of cautious trust passing between them. Mid-morning, Ethan noticed Derek and Lena huddled in the corner of the office, speaking in hushed tones. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but Lena's nervous glances toward Maya's desk made their target clear. Jason wandered over to join them, his face lighting up with the familiar smirk that often preceded one of Derek's schemes. Ethan decided to follow at a distance, positioning himself just close enough to catch snippets of their conversation. "She's too sensitive," Derek was saying, his voice dripping with mockery. "She's not cut out for this kind of work. Might as well give her a reason to quit." Lena hesitated, her voice quieter. "Do you think she'll actually leave? She looked pretty upset after yesterday." "That's the idea," Derek replied, leaning back with a smug grin. "Push her hard enough, and she'll save us the trouble of firing her." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. It wasn't just bullying, it was a calculated attempt to drive Maya out. He needed more than just his observations to take Derek down, though. He needed concrete evidence, something undeniable. He quietly stepped away before they could notice him, formulating the next phase of his plan. That opportunity came later that day, during a training session that Derek was supposed to lead for the team. Ethan had seen the calendar invite earlier and knew this was Derek's chance to put on a show, to reinforce his authority in front of the entire department. But Ethan also knew it was a chance to expose Derek's behavior. The training began predictably, with Derek taking center stage and turning what should have been an informative session into a platform for his ego. He cracked jokes at the expense of his team, using their mistakes as examples of what not to do. Maya, of course, was his favorite target. At one point, he pulled up a slide on the projector and said, "This is what happens when you don't double-check your work. Right, Maya?" His grin was wide, daring her to respond. Maya's face turned crimson, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan watched the others closely. Priya looked down at her notes, her shoulders tight with discomfort. Alex fidgeted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Even Jason and Lena seemed uneasy, though they quickly masked it with nervous laughter. Ethan decided it was time to act. "Actually, Derek," he said, his voice calm but firm, "isn't it the team leader's job to ensure mistakes like that don't happen? I mean, if there's confusion about the process, wouldn't that reflect on how the expectations were communicated?" The room went still. Derek froze mid-smirk, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face Ethan. "Excuse me?" Ethan kept his tone measured, his expression neutral. "I'm just saying, Mistakes usually happen because there's a gap in communication. It seems like focusing on solutions would be more productive than assigning blame. For a moment, Derek said nothing. The silence was deafening, every eye in the room bouncing between the two men. Then, Derek let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "You've been here, what, a few days? And you think you know how to run the team better than I do?" "I'm just pointing out an observation," Ethan replied evenly. "No offense intended." Derek's jaw tightened, but he forced a grin. "Noted," he said curtly, before turning back to the projector. "Let's move on." The tension in the room lingered long after the session ended. As the team filed out, Ethan caught Maya's eye. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of what he had done. Priya paused briefly by Ethan's desk, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for saying something," she said before hurrying away. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the undercurrent of unease was impossible to ignore. Derek's demeanor had shifted further, his forced smiles unable to hide his growing frustration. Ethan knew he had poked the bear, but he also knew it was necessary. As the office emptied out for the evening, Ethan stayed behind, using the quiet to finalize his plan. He had seen enough. Tomorrow he would confront the HR manager about the buried complaints, using his position as owner to demand action. But more importantly, he would gather the team after hours, away from Derek's influence, and give them a chance to speak openly. He was done watching. It was time to take control. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office with a clear goal. He had spent the previous night preparing for what he knew would be a critical step, confronting the HR department about their failure to address the toxic culture. Ethan had reviewed employee complaints, finding a disturbing trend of dismissal and inaction. These failures weren't just Derek's doing. They were systemic, and they demanded immediate attention. Ethan kept his temp persona intact as he worked through the morning, staying quiet but observant. Derek, as expected, was in rare form. His tone was sharper, his humor more biting, and his attempts to assert dominance even more transparent. He was clearly rattled by Ethan's challenge during the training session, though he hid it behind his usual arrogance. At lunchtime, Ethan quietly slipped away to the HR office, a small, unassuming corner of the building that seemed far removed from the pulse of the company. The HR manager, Angela Martinez, was seated behind her desk, her expression neutral, but professional. Ethan closed the door behind him and sat down, removing his visitor badge and placing it on the desk between them. Angela raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking from the badge to Ethan's face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we talked about the real issues in this company." Angela's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "What do you mean, Mr. Grayson?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Ethan Grayson," he said evenly, "founder and CEO." The shift in Angela's demeanor was instant. Her posture stiffened, her expression shifting to a mix of surprise and nervousness. Mr. Grayson, I didn't realize." "That's the point," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharper now. "No one does. I've been working undercover in operations for the past week, and what I've seen has been unacceptable. Employees are being bullied and humiliated, complaints are being ignored, and the culture is toxic. This isn't the company I built, Angela, and I want to know why." Angela opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan held up a hand. "I've reviewed the records," he continued. "There have been multiple complaints about Derek Chambers and his behavior, but nothing's been done. Instead, those complaints have been dismissed, and Derek has been allowed to thrive while employees like Maya Rivera are targeted and pushed to the breaking point. I want an explanation." Angela hesitated, her gaze dropping to the desk. "Mr. Grayson, I can assure you, we take all complaints seriously. But sometimes—" "Sometimes what?" Ethan pressed, his voice low but cutting. "Sometimes it's easier to look the other way, to avoid confrontation? Let me make one thing clear. This stops now. I want a full review of Derek's behavior and every complaint that's been filed against him, and I want you to work with me on a plan to rebuild the culture here, starting today." Angela nodded slowly, her face pale. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll start pulling the files right away." Ethan's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Good. And Angela? I'm not just asking you to follow through on this. I'm holding you accountable. I'll be involved every step of the way." As he left the HR office, Ethan felt a surge of determination. The first domino had fallen, and now it was time to push forward. That evening, Ethan put the second part of his plan into action. Once the office emptied out, he approached Priya at her desk. "Priya, could you help me gather a few people after hours? Maya, Alex, anyone else who might be willing to talk? We need to have an honest conversation about what's happening here." Priya hesitated, her brow furrowing. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that Derek isn't invited to," Ethan said simply. Priya studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I'll see what I can do." By 7 o'clock, a small group had gathered in the break room: Priya, Alex, Maya, and 2 other employees who had been silent observers during Derek's tirades. Ethan stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed as he addressed them. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "And I know some of you might be afraid to speak up. But I want you to know you're safe here. I'm not just a temp worker. My name is Ethan Grayson. I'm the owner of this company." A stunned silence fell over the room. Maya's eyes widened, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Alex looked as though he might faint. Priya, to her credit, didn't seem entirely surprised, though her lips pressed into a tight line. "I went undercover because I needed to see the truth for myself," Ethan continued, "and what I've seen is unacceptable. Derek's behavior, the way complaints have been handled, it's not okay. But I can't fix this alone. I need your help. I need you to tell me what's really been happening." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Priya stepped forward. "It's been bad," she said quietly. "Derek, he makes it impossible to do our jobs. He picks favorites, humiliates people in front of the team, and makes sure anyone who crosses him pays for it." Alex nodded, his voice shaking as he added, "He makes you feel like you don't belong, like you're not good enough." Maya stayed silent, her hands clenched in her lap. Ethan turned to her gently. "Maya, do you want to share anything?" Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. "I don't think he wants me here. He's been trying to get me to quit since the day I started." Ethan's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "That's going to change," he said firmly. "I promise you." The conversation continued, the employees gradually opening up as they realized Ethan was genuinely listening. By the end of the meeting, Ethan had a clearer picture of the damage Derek had caused and the steps he needed to take to fix it. As the group dispersed, Maya lingered behind. She approached Ethan hesitantly, her gaze uncertain. "Thank you," she said softly, for listening and for believing us." Ethan smiled, his expression kind. "Thank you for trusting me. Things are going to get better. I promise." Maya nodded, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, there was a spark of hope in her eyes. The next morning, word of Ethan's secret meeting had not yet spread, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Derek moved through the office with his usual swagger, but there was something forced about it, a nervous energy that betrayed his confidence. Ethan noticed the way his eyes lingered on Priya and Maya, as if searching for cracks in their composure, some hint that they might be conspiring against him. He didn't know about the meeting, but his instincts told him something was shifting. Ethan, meanwhile, was working on 2 fronts. On one hand, he continued his undercover routine, subtly encouraging the team and keeping Derek off balance. On the other, he was coordinating with Angela in HR to prepare for the confrontation that would soon bring everything to a head. The complaints against Derek were damning. Pages of detailed accounts that painted a clear picture of his toxic behavior. But Ethan knew the evidence wasn't enough. To truly change the culture, He needed to empower his employees to stand up and reclaim their workplace. The opportunity came during the weekly department meeting. Derek, still oblivious to Ethan's true identity, was at the helm as usual, leaning against the conference table with his arms crossed. His tone was sharp and patronizing as he rattled off the team's performance metrics, sprinkling in passive-aggressive comments about missed deadlines and rookie mistakes. "And let's not forget our star performer," Derek said with a smirk, glancing at Maya. 5 errors in 1 week. Impressive, right?" The room fell silent. Maya's face flushed, and she stared at the table in front of her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but kept his expression neutral. He waited a beat, then spoke up. "Actually, Derek, I think we should focus on solutions instead of pointing fingers," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. "If there's a recurring issue, maybe it's worth looking at how we can support the team better." Derek turned to him, his smile tightening. "Support the team? What are you, some kind of motivational speaker now?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "No, I'm just someone who believes that leadership is about building people up, not tearing them down." A faint murmur ran through the room. Priya glanced at Ethan, her expression a mix of surprise and quiet approval. Even Alex straightened in his chair, as though emboldened by Ethan's words. Derek, however, was less amused. His smirk faded, replaced by a thin veneer of civility. "Well, Eli, I appreciate your input," Derek said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But I've been running this team for years, and I think I know how to get results." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to command attention. "And yet, the turnover rate in this department is 3 times higher than the company average. Doesn't that say something about the way the team is being managed?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. For a moment, it looked as though he might explode, but he forced a tight smile instead. "We can discuss metrics later," he said curtly. "Let's move on." The tension lingered long after the meeting ended. Ethan noticed Derek pulling Lena and Jason aside, speaking to them in hushed tones. He could only imagine what threats or schemes Derek was concocting to maintain his grip on the team. But Ethan wasn't worried. He had planted the seeds of change, and he could see them beginning to take root. Later that day, Ethan met with Angela in the HR office to finalize their strategy. Together they drafted an action plan that would address not only Derek's behavior, but also the systemic issues that had allowed it to persist. The plan included mandatory leadership training, a new anonymous reporting system, and a series of town hall meetings where employees could voice their concerns directly to Ethan. It was ambitious, but it was exactly what the company needed. "We'll present this at the company-wide meeting on Friday," Ethan said, his tone resolute. "But before we do, I need to handle Derek." Angela hesitated. "Are you sure you want to confront him directly? He's not the kind of person who takes accountability well." Ethan nodded. "That's exactly why I need to confront him. This isn't just about him. It's about showing the entire team that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not anymore." The confrontation came sooner than expected. Late that afternoon, Derek stormed into the break room, where Ethan was sitting with Maya and Priya, discussing a routine project. His face was flushed, his movements jerky with barely concealed rage. "Eli!" Derek barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "A word. Now." Ethan rose calmly, motioning for Priya and Maya to stay seated. "Sure," he said, his tone mild. "What's on your mind?" Derek led him into a nearby hallway, away from prying eyes. The moment they were alone, he rounded on Ethan, his eyes blazing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Challenging me in front of the team? Undermining my authority?" Ethan crossed his arms, his expression unflinching. "I'm doing what a leader should be doing, standing up for the people who work here." Derek laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't know anything about leadership. You've been here for what, a week? You're just a temp. You don't know how things work around here." Ethan let the words hang in the air for a moment before he spoke. "Actually, Derek, I know exactly how things work around here. I've been watching you for the past week, how you humiliate your team, how you push people to the breaking point, how you manipulate the system to protect yourself." Derek's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" Ethan straightened, his voice cold and authoritative. "My name is Ethan Grayson. I'm the owner of this company." The color drained from Derek's face. For a moment, he simply stared at Ethan, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. You're lying," he finally stammered. Ethan pulled out his wallet and showed his ID badge, the one with his full name and title. "Do I look like I'm lying?" Derek stumbled back a step, his confidence crumbling. I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "But that doesn't excuse your behavior. I've seen everything, Derek. The way you treat Maya, Priya, Alex, and everyone else on this team. The way you've abused your position to make yourself untouchable, that ends now." Derek's face twisted with desperation. "Look, I was just trying to keep the team in line. You know how hard it is to manage people. Sometimes you have to be tough." "Being tough isn't the same as being cruel," Ethan shot back. "You don't build a strong team by tearing people down. You failed as a leader, Derek, and you failed this company." The hallway was silent, except for the sound of Derek's labored breathing. He seemed to realize there was no way out, no argument that could save him. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll meet with HR," Ethan said. "They'll review the complaints against you and determine the appropriate consequences. In the meantime, you're suspended. Turn in your badge and leave the building." Derek stared at him, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, he removed his badge and handed it over before walking away. Ethan watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. The first battle was over, but the war for the company's culture was just beginning. When Ethan returned to the break room, the team was waiting anxiously. Priya and Maya looked up, their expressions filled with uncertainty. Ethan gave them a small, reassuring smile. "Derek's gone," he said simply, "and things are going to change around here." Maya's eyes filled with tears, and Priya let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. For the first time, the room felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Ethan knew there was still work to be done, but in that moment he allowed himself to hope. Change had begun, and there was no turning back.